Human cognition processes incoming environmental data through a strict bottleneck. We call this working memory. It is the active, temporary workspace where information is held and manipulated in real time. Many educators and cognitive professionals operate on the assumption that this workspace is elastic. The prevailing belief is that targeted interventions and brain training exercises can expand a student's working memory capacity, allowing them to hold and process more variables simultaneously. To test the validity of that assumption, we have to separate cognitive hardware from cognitive software. Hardware represents the innate structural capacity of the brain. Software represents the efficiency and strategies an individual uses to manage information within that capacity. Jessica Blasik's 2011 doctoral dissertation from Duquesne University put this hardware expansion theory to a rigorous empirical test. The study involved a total of 55 fourth-grade students. Blasik tracked the specific effects of a keyword mnemonic intervention, a structured memory strategy, on the distinct components of their working memory systems. By isolating each subcomponent before and after the intervention, the data reveals that mnemonic training does not upgrade the underlying cognitive hardware. Equipping a student with a strategy to improve academic recall relies on an entirely different mechanism than expanding their structural working memory capacity. Before we can evaluate the exact impact of an educational intervention, we need a precise structural map of what capacities are actually being tested. This node-based diagram illustrates Alan Badley's 2000 multi-component model of working memory. It maps an overarching central executive connected to a central episodic buffer, flanked by two highly specialized slave systems. The first slave system is the phonological loop. This is a highly vulnerable temporary storage subsystem responsible for maintaining auditory and verbal data, which rapidly decays without continuous rehearsal. Operating in parallel is the visuospatial sketchpad. This subsystem processes and maintains visual features, physical locations, and spatial relationships. Between them sits the episodic buffer. This is the semantic integration hub, where incoming sensory data from the slave systems is bridged with meaningful context from long-term memory. These localized storage and integration systems do not operate autonomously. They are actively governed and directed by a central attention controller, known as the central executive. Working memory operates as a network of highly specific, measurable domains, rather than a single generalized mental container. To accurately track cognitive change, researchers must isolate the specific operational functions taking place within the central executive itself. We use Miyake's 2000 fractionation model to break the executive down into three correlated yet distinct domains of measurement. The first domain is inhibition. This is a subject's ability to exert deliberate, controlled suppression over a prepotent or automatic physical response. We measure inhibition in children using incongruent stimulus tasks, such as the Stroop test. The child must actively suppress the ingrained urge to read the text and instead focus their attention on stating the color of the ink. The second domain is shifting. This requires cognitive flexibility, demanding the subject to continuously switch back and forth between completely different mental sets without blending the rules together. Shifting is assessed using category switch tasks, where a subject might sort items by color on one prompt and by shape on the very next, requiring rapid disengagement from the previous rule. The final domain is updating. This involves the dynamic monitoring of incoming information, where the brain must actively replace irrelevant, outdated data with newly relevant inputs to maintain a sequence. Blasik ran all 55 fourth graders through a comprehensive assessment battery testing every single one of these domains, establishing a strict, quantifiable baseline for their cognitive hardware. By fractionating the executive, the study created a framework to pinpoint exactly which cognitive gear a mnemonic intervention would turn, or fail to turn. The experimental group was assigned keyword mnemonics as their intervention strategy. Keyword mnemonics rely on a process called dual encoding. The subject purposefully pairs an auditory cue with a distinct visual image, forcing the episodic buffer to integrate multiple sensory inputs to improve retention. The experiment followed a precise timeline: the initial pre-test battery to establish the baseline, followed by a 10-hour mnemonic intervention for the experimental group, concluding with a post-test for all participants. If working memory functions like a muscle, Completing 10 hours of intense dual encoding training should yield an observable increase in raw storage capacity or executive efficiency. These scatter plots represent the results of the multivariate analysis of covariance, or MANCOVA. We are looking at the baseline pretest distributions for both the control group and the intervention group. When we plot the post-test scores for the phonological loop and the visuospatial sketchpad, the points perfectly overlap the pretest distributions. The data shows zero significant statistical variance in the non-executive slave systems. This static result held true across the entire architecture. The fractionated executive domains of inhibition, shifting, and updating remained entirely unchanged. A null result in this context serves as highly conclusive data. It actively disproved the assumption that short-term mnemonic training triggers structural neuroplasticity or expands innate cognitive limits. The students successfully learned and applied a brand new, highly effective memory strategy, yet their baseline cognitive architecture remained completely static. We can explain this outcome by returning to our initial metaphor. The cognitive hardware is fixed, the software simply adapts. Working memory capacity behaves much like general intelligence. It acts as an innate, highly stable cognitive trait that heavily resists structural expansion. The null result does not render mnemonic interventions useless in an educational setting. They remain highly effective tools for improving academic recall and test performance. Mnemonics succeed because they act as a compensatory strategy. They do not build capacity. They compensate for the lack of it. This flowchart illustrates how compensatory strategies increase encoding efficiency. By utilizing dual encoding, the brain repackages incoming data, smoothly bypassing the need to brute force information through the fixed capacity limits of any single slave system. This data presents a clear directive for instructional designers, cognitive scientists, and educators. Curriculum designs aim at is structurally locked in place. The most effective educational environments respect the immovable limits of the human cognitive engine. They abandon the pursuit of larger capacity and focus entirely on optimizing the software we use to encode the world.